Our speaker today is Bob Ray. Many of you would remember the Honorable Bob Ray. He's now serves as Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. Now, prior to his current appointment, Mr. Ray served as Canada's special envoy on humanitarian and refugee issues, continuing the important work that he began in 2017 as Canada's special envoy to Myanmar. The former Premier of Ontario and the former interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, Mr. Ray was elected 11 times to federal and provincial parliaments, beginning in 1978 and through to 2013. He stepped down as a member of parliament in 2013 to return to private practice and legal practice, and in particular to work with Indigenous communities and continue his work in education, governance, and human rights. His passion for social justice dates back to his early days in student politics and community service. Mr. Ray is a privy councillor, a companion of the Order of Canada, and a member of the Order of Ontario. And he has numerous awards and honorary degrees from institutions in Canada and around the world. He received his honors bachelor degrees in modern history from the University of Toronto and a master's of philosophy degree as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. And he graduated from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. So it gives me great pleasure today to introduce to you Ambassador Bob Ray. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. I'm going to speak for a few minutes, and then there'll be lots of time for questions. As I often do, I think it's important to look at the issue of global development from a historical point of view. The first global agency that really looked at some of the issues that are being actively discussed in the Sustainable Development Goals was the International Red Cross. The Red Cross was founded in the middle of the 19th century, and it was really intended to try to see what we could do to deal with the most extreme examples of suffering that were taking place in the world, and what kind of humanitarian intervention could we create to deal with the costs and consequences of war and conflict. After the First World War, which was a disastrous conflict, Canada was one of the members, the League of Nations, and also one international organization, and the second international organization to be dedicated to international development, and that was the International Labour Office, which is still in existence today. The ILO, which still has its headquarters in Geneva, which is where the League of Nations was the first effort to try to build workers' rights, respect trade unions, and to see what could be done to use the bargaining power of trade unions to create a more level playing field when it comes to working conditions and health and safety, wages, but most importantly, establishing clearly the dignity of work and the rights of working people. So the First World War was a catastrophe for global development. The Second World War, which came 25 years later, was an even greater catastrophe for global development. And so the United Nations was formed in 1945. And the purpose of the UN, which is set out in the Charter, was to try to protect all rights across the board, including social rights and economic rights, and to improve the human condition and to end the scourge of war. And when that process was begun in 1945, the world really began to look at what could we do to enhance development. Important to remember that until fairly recently, many countries were governed by other countries. That the process of decolonization and of increasing national sovereignty really got started after 1945 and grew tremendously through the 50s and 60s and 70s. We now have 193 countries in the UN. When we started, we were only 53. the reality of the world has been that it's an unequal place. And that is something which the United Nations is dedicated to trying to change. Not to create absolute uniformity of conditions, but to try to make sure that people are not falling too far behind, and they're not falling deep into traps of poverty and hunger, and that we're able to make sure that the world is developing apace. I think it's fair to say that the first time the UN system tried to organize a process whereby we would look at how are we doing, what kind of progress are we making, were the Millennium Development Goals, which had to do with the millennium of 2000. And the reason we now have the Sustainable Development Goals is because, frankly, the Millennium Development Goals worked so well. They were very much focused on the situation of developing countries, of the countries that did not have the real equality that we were looking for in the world. But I think it's fair to say that the Sustainable Development Goals were the product of a long period of reality check, where we realized that development is not just about how much money you have in your pocket. Development is about how much education do you have, how healthy are you, and also what is the damage that we're doing to the planet, and trying to make sure that the notion of sustainability, which really began to be widely discussed globally in the 1970s and 80s, would be built into a system whereby we would measure how are we doing. And that's why we now have the Sustainable Development Goals. As you all know, we have 17 of them. And the question that now arises, that you've asked me to talk about, is how are we doing? So I'm going to show you this chart. You can see it. You can see it's green and yellow and red and gray. The green is the good news. The yellow is the okay news. The red is the bad news, and the gray is we don't know. We don't have the data to measure. So that gives you a sense. There aren't too many areas where the green is really growing. There are a lot of areas that are dominated by yellow and red, and there's way too much gray. So the short answer is we're not doing so great. When the development goals were passed and decided and ratified, debated, by the time we got there, it was around 2015. And so we established a goal of 2030. First thing you have to say is 2030 is an arbitrary date. So when people say you haven't reached the Sustainable Development Goals, you say, well, how realistic was the 15-year target? That's not an excuse for us to say we haven't done too badly, but it is a way of saying a lot of the goals that we're establishing are, if you'll pardon the expression, political goals, maybe even aspirational goals. And what we're racing with and dealing with all the time is how much time do we have before we really done real damage to the planet? And what are the things that are setting us back in the achievement of the goals? I think it's fair to say that there have been 3 or 4 big issues that have kept us back. The first is the fact that because of technological change, it seems that those countries that are doing well do even better, that their incomes go up, that their standard of living is improved, and they just keep on racing forward. And yet at the same time, there are some countries that have not been able to take advantage of the technological revolution and are still staying stuck way back in the pack. And there are a number of other countries that have been able to get some of their feet on the ladder that are moving up a little bit. But there's a few realities that have come home to us that I think make life even more difficult. The first was the pandemic, which came in 2020, and that has had a dramatic impact on slowing the achievement of the goals, slowed down global development, global prosperity, and has also created a health tragedy for a great many countries. We've lost a lot of people to COVID-19, and tragically, we're still losing them. We have not yet come out of the COVID era, although psychologically we may think we've emerged, reality is not quite yet. The second major blockage, if you like, is climate change. Climate change has really slowed down a number of countries. It's created havoc because of difficulty in growing crops, difficulty in allowing people to get the food that they need, and difficulty in dealing with the impact of severe weather. We have a crisis of emissions. That's to say, too much stuff still going up into the air and getting stuck. And secondly, we've got a crisis of adaptation, the resilience factor. So we know, you in Alberta know very well, forest fires, floods, droughts. These are exacerbated by climate change, made much more serious, and have globally had a very negative effect. The third is conflict. The expansion of conflict, not the diminution of conflict. And conflict is a big killer of economic growth. It's also stops us from doing some of the things we need to do to make the planet a better place to live. It kills lives, takes away people's well-being. It's a terrible thing, and it's expanding and growing, and that's a genuine problem. One of the things that is at one and the same time a consequence of all these things, but also a way of exacerbating the issue, is the issue of global displacement. People are being moved. People are no longer able to stay where they were, and they're being forced to move, and they're facing great difficulty. So you put all these things together, and you see how challenging it is for us to be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. But the challenge for us now is to recognize that there's a logic to the goals. And when you look at the 17 of them, they're all just sort of a to-do list for any sensible society. They're not capitalist goals or socialist goals. They're not Liberal Party goals or Conservative Party goals. They're just the goals that we would want pretty well any society that we were living in to be able to move. So basic things like no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work, economic growth, industry innovation, building better infrastructure, reducing inequality, sustainable cities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below the water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, partnerships for the goals. These are all the elements these are the 17 that are in place for the Sustainable Development Goals. We're supposed to, under a UN resolution, reach there by 2030. And I think we all know we're not going to be able to do that, partly because of the setbacks that we've faced, partly because we may not have been completely realistic in how big a challenge we were setting for ourselves. So what we're dedicating ourselves to these days is saying, how can we get these things back on track? How can we recommit to achieving and making progress in these areas? And how can we measure better what we're doing? How can we collect more data to make sure we're getting there? And how can we integrate them into our lives? For me, the most interesting thing about the SDGs, as we call them, is that unlike the Millennium Goals, which were really for developing countries only, because the assumption was, well, you know, the advanced economies, you guys don't need any of this stuff. But what we've learned is that we actually do all need them. There is no rationality to having a smoking section on an airplane. But Andy Knight and I can remember the time when there was such a thing. It's ludicrous, right? Yeah, because you say, well, that's an enclosed space. But hey, guess what? So is the atmosphere. The world is one. We have global problems. We need global institutions. we need global measurements, we need global policies. And I have to say that I think one of the other reasons why we've fallen behind is that we've not been, as a country, Canada and every other country, has not been concentrating enough on what it is that it will take to get us to sustainable development, not just for me, not just for my neighborhood, not just for my city or my province or my country, but what will get us there for the globe. Because the suffering we're seeing and the challenges we're seeing are global. They don't know any borders or boundaries. They are just there as global realities. So we have to be part of the challenge of getting out of the doldrums, if you like, that we're in. And that's really what these goals are all about. We spend a great deal of time here in New York, in Geneva, working with other countries on how can we set better standards, how can we measure better how we're doing, and how can we make sure we're pursuing policies that will actually make a difference. That's what we're trying to do. That's what Canada's policy is all about. And now it's going to be your turn to ask me questions about those policies. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Bob Ray, Ambassador Ray. And now we go to the top for questions. Remember that you can go to menti.com and the code to type in is 97918517. And that will allow you to ask your questions online. I want to lead off with a question that has to do with the challenges that Bob Ray talked about. You know, we set the goals for 2030. Obviously, those goals are being reduced in terms of numbers, getting to that point because of the pandemic, because of climate change, because of food insecurity, conflicts. The Middle Eastern conflict right now is another example of this, and the global displacement, the rise in refugees, and so on. And of course, the globe has to be treated as one place. So we can't afford to have these problems continue. And I know that the 2030 goal has been probably a little bit ambitious. Do you think that we ought to be revising that date to give us a little bit more time to achieve some of these goals?
Well, I don't know whether people want to do that or not. My sense is that that's not the current appetite. The current appetite is to keep going and to do whatever we can to make progress. I mean, I think we need to understand that on an issue that's as clear as climate change, for example, we're not there in terms of reducing emissions. So the interim target is to lower the emissions so that the emissions are going down year over year instead of going up year over year. We're still polluting the atmosphere at a mighty rate. And that's in part because of us from Canada and other countries who are our neighbors, but it's also because of newly industrializing countries like China and India, which have huge populations, which are seeking more and more the good life, the prosperous life. And none of us are thinking enough about, we all want to get to prosperity, but we don't want to do it by polluting the planet, because when we do that, we're going to stop the achievement of prosperity, because prosperity will become impossible if life on the planet is unsustainable. So I think we're all keeping our eye, and that's why we have a meeting every year to see how we're doing on climate change, these so-called COP meetings that are really intended to see what can we do to increase the pressure on governments and on businesses and on citizens to do more to get the emissions down and eventually get us to what's called net zero. So I don't think the 2030 goals will be revised until 2030. And I think in 2030 we'll say, here's the goals for 2040. Because these goals don't stop. It's not something you say, I've made it, I've achieved it, because none of them are totally achievable. It's a struggle. that we're all in, and we have to understand that that's the way it goes.
We have a great question from the audience. Of course, Canada has an obligation to report on its progress towards supporting this SDGs. How is Canada doing right now? I mean, I know you said we have to report back to the UN on how we're doing, but how is Canada doing in your opinion?
I have to be careful. I like my job. I want to keep my job, but I would say uneven. To be blunt, I think there are certain things that we've done better, and I think the facts will bear this out. I think we're better nourished. I think we're doing better in terms of broad standard of healthcare. I think we're doing better in terms of education. I think we've fully committed, whether we're fully there or not. I don't think we are, but we're certainly committed to doing more on ending discrimination against women and girls and finding ways of doing better. And as I go down the list, I think you can say we're doing better. Where are we falling back? Well, housing would be a very good example where we really aren't doing as well as we should be to make sure that people are well housed. We've taken a lot of people out of poverty, but we still have people in poverty. We've made real improvements mainly because of programs like the child tax credit, which have made a real difference in how we're doing. So when our government made its presentation last summer, which you can see online, to the committee of the UN, the Economic and Social Committee of the UN, which looks at how we're doing and at the national assessments, we did not paint a picture that was entirely rosy. That was said we're perfect, we have nothing to worry about. Our emissions are still going up, as I've said. I also think that one of the other things that we pointed to was the continuing issue of inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, inequality between different parts of our country. So you can create a report card that I think shows we're doing better in some areas, not as well in other areas. But I think the main challenge we face is really creating this understanding that we share life on this planet, that we have to be thinking in a more circular, sustainable way about how our economy will work, that we can't just create pollution and say there's no problem here, and that we'd have a job to do to make sure that all of our lives are fully sustainable. So we've still got work to do.
Yeah, on the issue of, Ambassador, on the issue of migration, which I think is a major challenge, especially in light of the conflicts that we see around the globe, which is pushing people out of conflict zones and into places like Canada. Why is Canada not doing more to take in and accommodate Palestinian refugees compared to their approach towards, say, Ukrainian refugees? This is one of the questions that have been asked from the audience.
We have increased immigration from Gaza in response to the crisis in Gaza. We've increased the possibilities for family reunification. And I hope we can continue to do more in that area. I think we need to do more. One of the most important things to know is that Canada per capita is doing more in this area than almost any other advanced economy. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have to, that means we can stop. No, we can't stop. Let's keep going. But it does mean that we need to understand that Canada alone is not going to solve the displacement problem as a result of what's taken place in Gaza. Whatever we do in conjunction with others, with our UN partners, United Nations High Commission on Refugees, other organizations. That's what we have to do. The only statement I would make about your comment about displacement, which is a very important phenomenon, I began studying it closely when I was the special envoy on the Rohingya, is that people mainly go to their neighbors. They don't come to us. We don't have a huge number of Rohingya refugees in Canada. In my opinion, we should have more, but we don't have that many. One of the challenges is that people tend to go next door. And if next door is available, that's where they go. The problem is next door then gets problem. You got to have, well, what do we do with people who are coming in? So whether you're going from Venezuela to Colombia, or you're going from Ecuador to Brazil, or you're going from Sudan to South Sudan, or you're going from South Sudan to Kenya, you've got to think about where is this stopping point, and how do we make sure that these countries are able to take care of the people who are coming in? We have a very high target for admitting refugees and for admitting immigrants. Per capita, we're one of the leading countries in the world. But what we need to understand is that this is actually beneficial to the Canadian economy and beneficial to our economic growth and to our social inclusion. So, I mean, I think that the high numbers of immigration we've seen over the last few years, frankly, are great news. They're great news for Canada because we're able to take people in and they're able to contribute right away to our communities. And that's a very positive thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. One of my students I can see here submitted a question. She says that this seems like an issue that is very large, and they want to know how can individuals, such as students in our classes, do something about this particular problem of SDGs? How can individuals act on these?
That's a great question, because the SDGs are global and they're national and they seem to be very far away. But when you think about it, you got to ask yourself the question, look at the goals and say, how can I help end poverty? What can I do? How can I contribute? And you go down the list and say, how can I contribute? And they all require local action, local initiative, ways in which you can get involved on the ground in your communities to see how you can help other people, to see how you can demonstrate your kindness, how you can ensure that the policies we have on everything from fishing to education are truly sustainable and are not going to lead to environmental degradation and an end to biodiversity. So these are all practical examples, ways you can get involved in community organizations in order to be able to make a difference. So I would urge you not at all to think that these things are too far away from me. I think when the environmental movement started in my lifetime, really in a big way in the 60s, it all came from one person who began to get the world to think about what are the consequential impacts of our economic and social behavior, and teaching people how we treat the land, how we treat the earth, how we deal with issues is very much part of showing stewardship and showing a caring relationship with nature, with the land, with the water, with the air, and with each other. Indigenous people have been talking and living through these values for centuries. And we have to learn a little bit more of that sort of 7-generational thinking in our own lives. I think most importantly as individuals, what we have to learn is the importance of thinking more consequentially and less impulsively about how we live. Live with more reflection and act with more reflection. And I think those things are very personal. They come down to us as individuals, how we behave with each other and also how we behave with the world around us.
And that's an important point you raised. And I think this goes to this next question. And in Canada, of course, we know that First Nations do not have access to clean water. And I think this is a failure on the part of the Canadian government to do something about this. So Canada's failed in sharing basic human rights and prosperity at home. So how can we then become leaders in SDG goals if we're not first dealing with this problem at home?
Well, we deal with both things at the same time. That's the reality. The reality is it's not about, I can't do anything about this because I've got to deal with that. We need to understand the journey that we're on as a people, the journey of truth, of understanding, and of reconciliation, which leads to policy change and leads to a recognition of the dignity of all Canadians. And I believe that that's the journey we're on as a country and as a people. And I think it's a huge priority for us as a country and as a people. But we don't have the luxury of hanging around and saying, well, I only want to focus on that. I don't want to talk about how it's affecting other people, because the reality is the world is too small a place. And the issues are honing in on us all the time. So we have to, I think, when we're talking to people in other countries, one of the first things we do is to say, we're not coming in here out of a sense of perfection. We know that we have problems and issues, but frankly, every country has issues and problems with the mistakes that they made in the past. In many cases, the mistakes that people are still making. But that shouldn't stop us from having a global perspective. I still think that's very important.
Yeah, I think you have been very good in terms of pointing out not just the strengths of Canada in meeting some of the goals, but also some of the weaknesses. You talked about housing, you talked about the fact that we're still not yet where we ought to be with respect to elimination of poverty, and particularly inequalities within society. So one question that sort of related to this is, what actions can Canada take to get back on track if it wants to meet the goals by 2030? Will there be new goals set after 2030 if we don't meet particular goals? Will we then go revise the timetable for meeting those goals?
Well, I do think that we'll keep on setting goals. I think setting goals for ourselves is always a good idea, and it's a good approach for us to take. I think it's essential for us to not relax our sense of obligation towards the goals between now and 2030, which is why I don't think that there'll be a big revision of the goals. Or the timetable before 2030. But I think that when we get to 2030, to be realistic, we're then going to have to make an assessment as to, well, how could we actually move up some goals? How could we realistically, where I think we need to do more work is to understand that the goals that we set can't just be aspirational or political. They have to be based on what do we really think we can achieve in our own countries, and that that's a consensus number. And these numbers need to be thought through as objectively as possible. And we need to keep coming back to saying to ourselves, they've got to be based on the reality of what is it going to take to actually do what needs to be done. But it was a great poet, Browning, who said, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for. The fact is, there will always be goals that are just a little bit out of reach. It doesn't mean we don't try to reach them. Right. I think that's the spirit we should get into this with.
Yeah. There's a very discussion that came up just now. There are some groups within society that are actively impeding the SDGs. Is there any accountability structures put in place to deal with those individuals or groups that are impeding the SDGs? Because the rest of the global community who are working towards making a better change are being, stymied by those individuals that are trying to push back on the SDG goals.
Well, I think when you put them all together, when you put all the goals together, I do think, we do have laws. We do have, we do have laws. Something as simple as fishing laws. We have fishing laws. If you look like you're behaving in a way that's going to damage the fishery, you pay fines, you pay a price, you're held accountable. Yeah. I think one of the things that's implied in your question is a really important one, and that is that our accountability structures for how we're doing are not as strong as they need to be. This isn't just true for the SDGs, it's true globally. International law is not as strong as national law, doesn't have as much backup, not getting enforced well enough. But I do think we need to understand that there are those companies and those people who are making money from pollution. And we need to understand that pollution comes with a price in terms of its impact on the whole planet. So we have to build concepts in. We already are doing this. Just to be controversial for a moment, one of the reasons why I believe in carbon pricing is because I think we should be putting a price on pollution, and we should be looking at it that way, rather than saying it doesn't matter. We say it does matter, and we're going to have to reduce it. One of the best ways in our society to reduce bad behavior is to increase enforcement, and to put a price on the things that should become more expensive.
Well, there's a question from Alberta. How can we ensure that the progression that we make towards sustainability will not be disastrous for provinces like Alberta, whose economy is so reliant on fossil fuels?
Well, Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and British Columbia, many parts of the country, have come to become major energy producers. And I think any transition that is made in any country in the world has to be a transition that is thought through, that is fair, that doesn't put the burden on only one segment of the population for the change. And that's something that Canada advocates for all countries. I mean, I've just come back from visiting Guyana in South America, and they've discovered a lot of oil and gas in Guyana. So all of a sudden, it's gone from being a very, very poor country, and it will go to becoming a much, much wealthier country. But the Guyanese know that this resource will be finite and will be not there forever, and therefore they've got to get the most out of it that they can, and also ensure that their other policies are using the revenues to create opportunities for non-fossil fuel, for putting more money into renewables, for putting more money into innovation. And these are all things that any government in Canada has to be thinking about, and they are thinking about it, because we all know it's true.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think the Guyana situation reminds me of Nigeria as well. When you do have this excess of fossil fuels, you have to sort of take advantage of that in order to make lives better for all people within the country. So the wealth sort of trickles down to those people. There's a question here about
just come in on this. It's never too late to get smart about sustainability.
Yeah.
People say, well, we don't do that. We've never done it before. You say, it's not too late. There's time still to do this. And the fact is that when we say that we're going to, net zero means two words, net zero, not zero. It means net zero. So you think of, well, what are the ways in which I'm balancing my use of fossil fuels with taking other steps to offset what the environmental impact of fossil fuels will be. There's no way of knowing what technologies will be developed over the next 15 years and may be transformative in terms of the impact or how to get the pollution out, how to reduce it. There's all kinds of possibilities that we need to be open to, but we also have to understand that most people feel that the transition is here. It's not happening later. It's here. And you've got to plan the transition in a way that's as fair as possible to everybody. Nobody's talking about stopping everything in its tracks. People are talking a sensible, fair, just transition.
Yes, I think that's very important too. Now, Canada's position on the United Nations General Assembly votes, especially taking into consideration our commitments and obligations related to SDGs. Do you see times when our voting record diverges from our commitment on SDGs?
Well, I mean, they can always have an argument about it. But generally speaking, I don't think so. I think we try in the work that we do to be consistent in the presentations that we make and the policies that we advocate, and in the negotiating positions that we take in the COP negotiations, for example. I mean, we get questioned every time about our policy on any given subject matter, but I think it's important to stress, and the one area where I think we're vulnerable as a country is, well, are we doing enough to invest in development, in sustainability? Are we globally? Are we doing enough to sustain in the just transition? Are we doing enough to invest in what we need to be doing? Not so much voting, I think, as it is the consistency between what we know needs to be done and what we ourselves are apparently prepared to do. And that challenge is always there.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are some parts of the world that are doing better than others when it comes to SDGs. What are some of the successes in other parts of the world which Canadians can learn from, which Canada can learn from? Do you think?
Well, I mean, I think many of the Europe. I think the most logical place for us to look and understand what the potential is many countries in Europe, which started the energy transition earlier and have moved in a much bigger way to renewables than we have. They're not entirely like matchable with us because they're smaller countries in some cases where there's a much larger population that's much closer together. They don't have, the same geography that Canada has, and I think that's something we have to understand and explain to people as we look at areas in which people have done better. I think there are countries that have done better on providing more advanced childcare opportunities, daycare, and educational opportunities for younger people. Some countries have done better on their maternal leave policies than we've done. I mean, you can go down the list. There's lots of policies that are more advanced than ours. I've always said that the level of social cohesion that we have in our society, insofar as it depends on our ability to pay for it, requires levels of taxation, which I think we have to begin to say, well, that's not just an imposition. That's what's required of us to get to where we want to get to.
Right.
I would observe that the tendency is to criticize governments for spending money, but also want to have lower taxes, which, as we all know, is ultimately financially unsustainable. Sustainability is important as a financial element. What is sustainable from a financial and fiscal point of view? And that, I think, is part of the balance that is important for us to strike.
Yeah. That raises another question which comes up from the audience. Governments of Canada are struggling with higher costs and tighter budgets. How can we promote funding of international aid in the face of these current economic challenges? I think this comes at a time that we are being asked to pay more at the international level. But how can we do this in light of our own struggles to deal with higher costs and tighter budgets?
Well, good question. And I ask that question of my own government, and I have a very lively discussions with them about this challenge. But one of the things that we need to understand is the world is getting smaller, and we should not make the mistake of thinking that the money that we invest in development is for other people. It is not just for other people.
Right.
Money we invest in development is for us. It's for our prosperity. How can we expect people in other countries to pay for the goods, the food, the services, the inventions, the exports that we have, if they're getting poorer and poorer, and if they're living in conditions of conflict, and there's risks of what it will take for them to live day to day. We don't benefit from having a dangerous, violent, impoverished world. That does not benefit Canada. That comes at a price to Canada. And it's a very direct price. And the second point I'd make is our economy is totally much more than our neighbors to the south, the United States. Our economy depends on others. It depends on the state of prosperity in other countries. So our commitment to the UN, to multilateralism, to global prosperity, to doing more with and for others it's in our interest to do this. It's a good investment. It's an investment we need to make.
Yeah, I have a question here that talks, first of all, thanking you for the fantastic talk, Ambassador Ray, but also asking about conflicts. Conflicts are obviously a major challenge. Some would say that they take away too much of the world's funds that needs to be placed in development in other areas. We end up spending large amounts of money on armaments and dealing with conflicts. Is there any way of challenging some of that money away from conflicts to SDGs? And how would you recommend that?
Well, we'd love to do. I don't know anybody who wouldn't love to be able to do that. I mean, conflicts, yes, they're very expensive. I mean, they're expensive in taking away so many human lives, depriving many people of their position in society, and taking away their security, their homes. The conflict is a terrible thing. War is hell, and that's true. At a policy level, the problem is, what do you do when there's a very aggressive government like Russia that decides to invade its neighbor? Do you say, go ahead? We're too preoccupied with ourselves to get involved in that. Or do you say, that's wrong and we're going to do something about it? And as soon as we say and do that, it costs money. And we're spending money on tanks, we're spending money on guns, we're spending money on refugees, we're spending money. The whole thing is hugely expensive. But in some cases, I'm not quite sure what choice we have. And that's being very honest with you, that's one of the dilemmas we have. How much do we invest in defense? Well, if investing in defense actually prevents conflict, then that's a good investment. But if it fuels the conflict, then that's a question that we need to ask ourselves. But again, I think it's important not to be thinking in too short-sighted a way, to try to be thinking a little more practically and in realistic terms about, well, how do we create a safer world if we're not prepared to spend money on policing globally as well as at home?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this other question has to do with climate change, and it reminds me of Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, who keeps hammering home at this problem as being very, very, very much an existential threat to countries like Barbados and small island states. But as an expert, are you afraid for our future, or are you hopeful? This is one of the questions being asked. In light of the problems, the realistic recognition of climate change and climate crisis, are you afraid for our future, or are you hopeful?
Well, the trouble with fear is that it's disabling. If you get taken over by fear in your life and you're afraid, then you're not going to be thinking clearly. You've got other triggers coming into your head that are not necessarily going to be helpful. So my working proposition is hope. That's what keeps me going. That's what allows me to do my job every day, and it allows me to talk to other people about what do we need to do to make things better. And it works for me. So am I personally afraid? No. Am I fearful? No. Am I concerned? Absolutely. But I can't let this concern become a barrier to my determination to act in a constructive way. And I do think that fear always introduces a sense of the irrationality, and it creates a sense of panic. Nobody makes good decisions in a state of panic. And so we need to deal with it in a realistic, cool-minded way, but also in a way that addresses the problems. And I'm certainly not complacent. I'm certainly not hopeful because, I don't worry about it. Of course you worry about it, but the point is you've got to think more through how to deal with the worry rather than get preoccupied or taken over by it.
Great. Now I have two more questions, I think. One is, what is the hardest sustainable development goal for Canada to achieve and why?
Well, to be honest, I think there are two or three. I mean, I think one of them is this emissions question. I think it's hard for us to deal with the emissions issue because we've developed such a habit about how we drive, how our economic system works, how our energy systems work, and it's really, really hard. It appears to be really hard to get us to think more creatively about how do we do these things in a sustainable way. And it's taking a long time for us to develop new habits, which is what we have to do. It comes down to what we do as individuals. It also comes down to what businesses and governments decide to do. I think the other one that's difficult because we neglected it for so long, in the deepest sense, is the question of Indigenous equality and recognizing what disability, what being marginal, and what being on the sidelines can do to people, and how important it is to overcome that. I also think we're making a lot of progress, and I really do believe that's one area where we can keep making good progress in ways that might surprise us. At a practical level, I do think housing has become kind of an orphan of our social and economic policy. I'm delighted to see the federal government and many provincial governments taking housing more seriously. But we do know for one thing for sure, and that is that no society anywhere in the world has been able to provide enough diverse kinds of housing for its population without government intervening, being involved, helping to fund. Housing cannot be supplied only by the market. It depends a lot on government policy. And I think for a long time, we deluded ourselves into thinking that, it didn't matter, the supply was going to come along, everything will be fine. And I think we now know that's not true, and we need to apply that lesson as effectively as we can.
Final question, Ambassador. What is the role that Canadian universities can play in advancing the achievements of SDGs? Is there a role that individual institutions in Canada, like universities, can play?
Well, the first one is to adopt the goals.
Right.
I'm really struck by the number of institutions across Canada that talk about the SDGs, that talk about why we're doing this, why are we doing this, why are we changing our housing policies, why are we changing our heating policies, what are we doing about diversity, and what are we doing about inclusion, what are we doing to create greater equality. I think these things are driving a lot of institutions, not only in Canada, but around the world. I think our municipal governments have to embrace them. I think our kids need to embrace the SDGs when they're very young. We need to teach these things in school. And more people need to just say, these are not abstract rhetorical things. These are the world's to-do list. This is my to-do list. This is my municipal government, city government's to-do list. It's my university's to-do list. And that's how we have to be thinking. So yes, embracing by every institution is really critically important.
So thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. This has been a wonderful opportunity to have this exchange with you. And I think we benefit a lot from what you had to say. So I want to thank you and also thank the organizers of this event, including the University of Alberta International, as well as the Global Health folks who have been working very hard to make sure that you are here. We wish that you could be here in person, but we understand the difficulties of doing that today. But thank you very much for everything that you've done.